The morning my truck disappeared, I honestly thought someone had stolen it. I walked outside carrying a mug of coffee, still half asleep, expecting to see the same old blue pickup sitting in its usual spot across from Building C. And instead there was nothing there but an empty rectangle of pavement and a few oil stains where it had been parked the night before. For a second, I just stood there staring, like maybe my brain hadn't loaded properly yet. I even looked 2 rows over because sometimes after a long day, I'd park without really paying attention. But no, it wasn't there. My stomach dropped. That truck wasn't some weekend toy. It was how I made a living. I owned a small handyman business in Cedar Ridge, a suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes outside Columbus, and every tool I needed to work was inside that truck. My ladders, my drills, my contracts, half my life, basically. I pulled out my phone and started walking the lot, looking around for broken glass or anything that might explain what happened. That's when I noticed the bright orange paper attached to a parking sign near the entrance. It looked brand new, like it had been put up overnight. The notice said unauthorized vehicles would be towed immediately at the owner's expense. I remember reading it twice and thinking, what unauthorized vehicles? Everybody parked here. Then I noticed a towing company phone number printed at the bottom. I called. The woman who answered didn't even ask many questions. She looked at my plate number and said, "Yeah, we've got it." Just like that. Like she was telling me my pizza was ready. I asked what happened. She said the homeowners association had ordered the tow around midnight. To get my truck back, I needed to pay $350. $350. I almost laughed because it sounded so ridiculous. There has to be some mistake, I told her. I parked there for years. She sighed the way people do when they've had the same conversation 100 times and said, "Sir, you'll have to discuss that with the HOA." Then she hung up. By the time I got my truck back that afternoon, after borrowing money from my emergency fund and losing an entire day of work, I wasn't just angry. I felt embarrassed, powerless, like someone had reached into my pocket and taken money because they could. Now, if you've ever lived under an HOA, you probably know the type. Some are reasonable. Some help maintain property values and keep things organized. Ours was not one of those. Cedar Ridge had a board president named Gloria Whitmore, and Gloria treated the neighborhood like she was running a tiny kingdom. Grass too long? Violation. Trash can visible from a street? Violation. Holiday decorations still up after January 10th? Violation. One time my neighbor Frank got a warning because the shade of brown he used on his backyard fence wasn't on some approved color list nobody had ever heard of. People joked about it at cookouts. But underneath the jokes, there was always frustration. Gloria loved rules. More specifically, she loved reminding everyone that she was the one enforcing them. Looking back, I think that's why what happened next unfolded the way it did. Because for Gloria and a few others on the board, this was never really about parking. It was about authority, about making sure people remembered who was in charge. A couple days after getting my truck back, I attended the monthly HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs, stale coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The usual. When the open comment period started, I stood up and calmly asked why my truck had been towed after years of parking in the same spot. Gloria adjusted her glasses and smiled the kind of smile that somehow felt insulting. "The board recently reviewed parking compliance," she said. "Several vehicles were found to be violating updated enforcement guidelines." Updated when? I asked. Residents were notified. I never got anything. She shrugged. Actually shrugged. That's unfortunate. The room got quiet. Even some of the board members looked uncomfortable. Then Gloria added, "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Mercer." That was my last name. The way she said it felt less like an explanation and more like a challenge. I sat down because arguing in front of everyone wasn't going to solve anything. But on the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something fell off. Maybe it was the way Gloria avoided specifics. Maybe it was because nobody else seemed to know about these new parking rules either. Or maybe it was because I'd spent most of my adult life fixing things. And when something doesn't make sense, my instinct isn't to let it go. My instinct is to start taking it apart until I figure out what's really going on. So that's exactly what I did. The following weekend, I pulled every HOA document I could find. Bylaws, property maps, development plans, county records, meeting minutes going back years. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of paperwork. At first, I was just looking for proof that the board had violated its own notification procedures. Instead, I found something far stranger. One old development map from nearly 20 years earlier showed property boundaries that didn't quite match the current community layout. At first, I assumed it was a drafting error. Then I found another map. Then another. Each one raised more questions than answers. Late one night, around midnight, I was sitting alone with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad when I noticed something that made me sit upright in my chair. According to the original subdivision documents, part of the community parking lot wasn't actually located on HOA-owned land at all. It appeared to overlap with a parcel attached to my property. I stared at the map for a long time, convinced I was misunderstanding it. But the more records I checked, the more consistent the discrepancy became. By 2 a.m, I wasn't angry about the towing fee anymore. I was curious, and sometimes curiosity is far more dangerous than anger. The next morning, I convinced myself I was probably wrong. There had to be a mistake somewhere. Neighborhoods don't accidentally build parking lots on somebody else's property and then forget about it for 20 years. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But the idea wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I looked at those maps, the same question came back. What if they really had? So on Monday, I called a licensed surveyor named Ethan Collins. He had worked on commercial projects all over the county and came highly recommended. When I explained what I thought I'd found, there was a long pause on the phone before he finally said, "Well, that's unusual. Doesn't mean you're right, but it's unusual enough that I'd take a look." 3 days later, he showed up with equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission. Tripods, GPS units, laser measuring tools, more technology than I'd expected to see. A few neighbors watched from their porches as Ethan and his crew spent the day walking the property lines. I remember Frank wandering over and asking, "You building a secret bunker out here?" I laughed and said something like that. Truthfully, I didn't tell many people what was going on because I didn't want rumors spreading before I knew the facts. A week later, Ethan called me into his office. The moment I walked in, I could tell from the expression on his face that something was different. He slid a folder across the desk and said, "You might want to sit down." That's never a sentence that leads anywhere boring. I opened the folder and stared at the survey. There was in black and white, clear as day. Nearly 48% of the community parking lot sat on land legally attached to my parcel. Not a few inches, not a minor encroachment, almost half the lot. Apparently, when Cedar Ridge was originally developed, a contractor had shifted part of the parking area beyond the planned boundary line. Somehow the error was never corrected. Ownership records remained unchanged, while everyone simply assumed the lot belonged entirely to the HOA. For nearly 2 decades, nobody questioned it. Nobody noticed. Until now, I remember driving home in complete silence. No radio, no podcast, nothing. Just me trying to process what I'd learned. Most people think discovering something like that would feel exciting. It didn't. It felt heavy, because suddenly this wasn't about a towing fee anymore. This was about property rights, legal liability, community politics, and a situation that had the potential to create a massive conflict. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, but another part kept replaying Gloria's voice in my head. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Mercer." Fine, I thought. Let's talk about rules. The following week, I requested a meeting with the board. To their credit, they agreed. I walked into the clubhouse, carrying copies of the survey, county records, and supporting documents. Gloria sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 4 board members. The atmosphere felt tense before anyone even spoke. I laid everything out calmly and explained what the survey had found. At first, nobody said anything. One board member, a retired accountant named Dennis, looked genuinely shocked. He kept flipping through the pages as if expecting them to change. Gloria was different. She barely looked at the documents before pushing them aside. "This can't be correct," she said. "It's certified by a licensed surveyor," I replied. "Then the surveyor is mistaken. The county records match the survey." She crossed her arms. "The parking lot has belonged to the community for 20 years. Actually, according to the records, it hasn't." That's when the room changed. You could feel it. The conversation stopped being about facts and started becoming about pride. Gloria wasn't listening anymore. She was defending territory. I tried to keep things simple. I told them I wasn't interested in lawsuits. I wasn't trying to cause problems. I had two requests. First, reimburse the $350 I paid because my truck was improperly towed. Second, revise the parking policy so residents wouldn't be punished without proper notice. That was it. Honestly, looking back, it was probably the cheapest settlement they were ever going to get. Dennis seemed open to discussing it. A couple other members nodded. But Gloria shut the conversation down almost immediately. "We will not be bullied by manufactured claims," she said. Manufactured claims. I actually laughed because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Gloria, these are county documents. What I see is a resident attempting to exploit a technicality." There it was. The moment I realized compromise wasn't going to happen. Not because it couldn't happen, because she wouldn't allow it. The meeting ended with no resolution. As I gathered my papers, Gloria looked directly at me and said, "I strongly advise you not to create unnecessary conflict." It sounded like a warning. Maybe it was supposed to scare me. Instead, it made my decision surprisingly easy. On the drive home, I thought about all the opportunities they just had to fix the situation. They could have apologized. They could have refunded the money. They could have acknowledged the survey and negotiated a use agreement. They chose none of those options. What they chose was arrogance. And arrogance has a way of becoming very expensive. Over the next few days, I spoke with an attorney. Then another. I wanted to make sure every step I took was completely legal. The answer was straightforward. The property belonged to me. If I wanted to restrict access to it, I could. I wasn't obligated to provide free use indefinitely. Hearing that felt strangely surreal. I kept expecting someone to tell me there was some hidden catch. There wasn't. A week later, a construction crew arrived shortly after sunrise. The workers unloaded fencing materials while curious neighbors gathered nearby. Frank walked over carrying a cup of coffee and stared at the equipment. "You're actually doing it, aren't you?" he asked. "Looks that way. This is going to be one hell of a Tuesday." He wasn't wrong. By noon, temporary fencing followed the exact legal property line identified in the survey. The workers installed posts, attached panels, and placed private property signs at regular intervals. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a simple barrier marking land ownership. But the effect was enormous. By the time residents returned home from work that evening, nearly half the parking lot had vanished behind fencing. The neighborhood exploded. Cars circled endlessly looking for spaces. People parked along streets that had never been intended for overnight parking. Some residents knocked on my door demanding explanations. Others wanted copies of the survey. One woman actually brought cookies because she said she admired anyone willing to stand up to the HOA. That part made me laugh. The board, meanwhile, went into full panic mode. Emails started flying. Emergency notices appeared. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some residents blamed me. Others blamed Gloria. Most just wanted somewhere to park. The next HOA meeting looked less like a community gathering and more like a public trial. Every chair was filled. People lined the walls. The moment Gloria called the meeting to order, complaints started pouring in. A young father stood up first. "I have 2 kids and nowhere to park after 6 o'clock. An elderly resident complained about having to walk several blocks for her vehicle. Another demanded to know why the board hadn't resolved the property dispute before it reached this point. Gloria kept trying to redirect blame toward me. But every explanation seemed to make people angrier. Then someone asked a question she clearly didn't want to answer. "Is the land actually his?" Silence. You could hear the air conditioning humming. Finally, Dennis spoke up. "Based on the documentation we've reviewed, yes." The room erupted. For the first time, residents understood the full story. The board had known about the survey. They had been given an opportunity to resolve the dispute. They refused. Over the next several days, pressure mounted from every direction. Residents demanded answers. Attorneys started getting involved. Insurance concerns surfaced. Some homeowners even discussed voting board members out at the next election. Gloria's position was becoming harder to defend with each passing day. Meanwhile, I didn't say much. I simply maintained the fence and went about my life. Every morning, I drive past the crowded streets, and think about how differently this could have ended if someone had just admitted they were wrong. Then, one Friday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the HOA office. I answered and immediately recognized Gloria's voice. Except this time it sounded very different. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the superiority. In its place was something I hadn't heard from her before. Caution. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "the board would like to request an emergency meeting to discuss a possible resolution." I looked out the window at the fence running across the former parking lot and couldn't help smiling. Because after weeks of being treated like I was the problem, they were finally ready to talk. By the time I walked into that emergency meeting, the entire atmosphere had changed. A month earlier, I had been the guy sitting in a folding chair asking why his truck got towed. Now I was the one being offered coffee before the meeting even started. Funny how that works. The board members were already seated when I arrived. Dennis gave me a polite nod. A couple others looked exhausted. Gloria looked like someone who hadn't slept much in the past week. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then she cleared her throat and opened a folder. "We'd like to resolve this matter," she said. No speech about compliance. No lecture about rules. Just that one sentence. I almost didn't recognize her. The board presented a proposal. First, they would reimburse the full $350 towing fee. Second, they would revise the parking enforcement policy and establish a proper notification process before future towing actions could occur. Third, they wanted a formal easement agreement that would allow the community continued use of the disputed land. In other words, they wanted legal permission to keep using the part of the parking lot that belonged to me. I listened quietly and asked a few questions. Then I slid my own folder across the table. My attorney had helped prepare it. The terms were reasonable. The easement would be recorded officially with the county. The HOA would acknowledge the property boundary. Future boards couldn't simply pretend the issue never existed. Everything would be documented. Everything would be transparent. Dennis reviewed the paperwork and nodded almost immediately. A couple board members followed. Gloria remained silent for a long moment before finally signing. Watching her put that signature on the page felt strangely anticlimactic. For weeks I had imagined some dramatic victory speech or satisfying confrontation. Instead, it was just a pen moving across paper. That's usually how real life works. The biggest battles often end quietly. A few days later, the agreement became official. The reimbursement check arrived shortly afterward. Technically, I had one. At least that's what everyone kept telling me. Frank certainly thought so. He came over the day the fence was scheduled to come down, carrying a lawn chair and a cooler. "You know," he said, "most people get revenge with angry Facebook posts. You accidentally repossessed half a parking lot." I laughed. Wasn't exactly the plan. Still one of the greatest neighborhood stories I've ever seen. By noon, the construction crew returned. They removed the fencing section by section. Residents watched from sidewalks and driveways. Some waved. Some thanked me. A few probably still thought I was a troublemaker. That's fine. You're never going to make everybody happy. As the final fence panel came down, the parking lot looked whole again. Cars gradually returned to their spaces. The crisis that had consumed the neighborhood for weeks disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Life moved on, at least on the surface. But something had changed beneath it all. People questioned the HOA more often. Board meetings became better attended. Residents asked harder questions. Financial reports received greater scrutiny. Elections suddenly mattered to people who had ignored them for years. The illusion that the board could do whatever it wanted without consequences had been broken. And honestly, I think that was the most important outcome. Not the money, not the property dispute. Accountability. A few months later, I ran into Dennis at a local hardware store. We talked for a while near the lumber section. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "You know, Gloria wasn't entirely wrong about one thing." "What's that?" I asked. "Rules do exist for a reason." I laughed. "Yeah, they do." Then he smiled and added, "The problem is they apply to everybody." That pretty much summed up the entire situation. Looking back now, I don't hate Gloria. I don't even think she was some cartoon villain sitting around plotting against residents. I think she got caught in a trap that affects a lot of people once they have authority. She became so focused on enforcing rules that she stopped questioning whether those rules were being applied fairly. Somewhere along the way, protecting power became more important than admitting mistakes. And that's a dangerous thing, whether you're running a country, a corporation, or a homeowners association with a clubhouse and a parking lot. Every once in a while, someone asks if I would do it all again. Honestly, I don't know. The whole ordeal cost time, stress, legal fees, and more frustration than I ever wanted. There were nights when I wondered whether fighting back was worth it. There were moments when I considered dropping the issue entirely. But then I remember standing in that towing yard, paying $350 to retrieve my own truck after being punished by people who couldn't even explain what rule I broke. And I remember the way Gloria smiled when she told me rules exist for a reason. Maybe that's why I kept going. Not because of the money, not because of the land, because nobody should be forced to accept unfair treatment simply because the person responsible happens to hold a title. In the end, the HOA thought they were teaching me a lesson about compliance. Instead, they ended up learning one about ownership, accountability, and humility. They towed my truck overnight, hoping I'd quietly pay the fee and move on. A few weeks later, they were sitting across a conference table, asking permission to use land they never actually owned. That's a twist nobody saw coming, including me. And here's the question I've always wondered about ever since. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the towing fee and let it go? Would you have taken the refund offer if it had come earlier? Or would you have fenced off the property the moment you discovered the truth? Let me know down in the comments, because people are still divided about this one. Some say I went too far. Others say I didn't go far enough. Either way, I'd love to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a power-hungry board member, or a neighborhood dispute that spiraled completely out of control, share your story below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more real-life stories where ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary conflicts. Trust me, sometimes the smallest disputes end up creating the biggest consequences.